On December the 3rd, 1994, the PlayStation was released in Japan. On September the 9th, 1995, it was released in North America, and Europe had its release on the 29th of September 1995. This was the first console to ship over 100 million units, which was reached 9 years after its launch and could be said to be one of the most influential systems we ever had. Not that I knew this at the time of launch, as I was not one of the many who got one at release. My own experiences of the console at launch were primarily where and when I could play on friend systems, renting games and that from Blockbusters, and usually playing until sometimes silly in the morning. Once I had bought my own PS1, I slowly began to dive into the console scene and built a collection of games, some good, many terrible, but most memorable and usually completed in some form or another. So as we all celebrate the 25th anniversary of the PS1 in Europe, indulge my mental ramblings as I look over some gaming memories. Medal of Honor Underground. A sequel to Medal of Honor, strangely enough, this first-person shooter focused on you being a French resistance member fighting in World War II. The Underground being a reference to the French resistance and often having to fight in the tunnels and tombs of the various levels. I picked up the game as I enjoyed playing the original and found it to be a historical and satisfying story. Gameplay that today feels clunky and unresponsive was pretty damn good. Console FPSs being what they were at the time, while the console scheme made you feel like a tank, it did reward you for headshots and the positioning. The story was the most engaging though for me, pulling from actual history. The game had you playing as a female French resistance member fighting against the German army occupying France. She is found and recruited by the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, and is assigned to various missions around the warfront until 1944. The whole thing is based on Helen Deschamps Adams, a real-life member of the OSS, who also voices a mission briefing for the final mission, which is leagues over what the latest Battlefield games have tried. This is one of the few PS games that I kept at until I completed not only the campaign, but also the bonus extra crazy mission that came with it. Even when I went back to record the footage for this video, the game was engaging and as playable as I remembered it. Lastly, William Morgan Shepherd voices your main handler through the game, Colonel Stanley Hargrove. This is the guy who voices Lawrence Limburger from Biker Mice from Mars and is the narrator for Civ 5 amongst many other roles. To be frank, he rocked it.
Now I'm sorry to be crass, but while we've been aware of your brother Jacques for some time, we had never heard of Manon Baptiste until you made contact with our station chief yesterday morning.
GTA London. While this was originally a PC expansion for the first GTA, it did come out as a standalone game on the PS1, as well as being part of a compilation with the original. GTA was groundbreaking as a top-down criminal rampage game, and did indeed spawn many sequels. Having a London spin-off was a logical step, primarily because British criminal film genre is actually pretty damn epic. The game itself played pretty average for top-down shooting action games, especially on the console. However, the reason I picked this up was twofold: the British aspect and the comedy and themes that GTA happily spins within its games. Replaying this on the console shows how awkward the controls were, but back in the day I could happily overlook the tank controls that is the whole of the walking mechanics. Most of the time I really just enjoyed driving, sliding and learning the best routes to shake off the cops, finding all the power-ups, the tank rampages, and the cheesy British film references and awful London Cockney criminal accents. I never completed GTA London, although to be fair, I have not completed any of the GTAs, but the journey, replaying missions, or just driving around to the various Scar tracks, which I can't play due to YouTube, was one of the best experiences I could have had. Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. A sequel to a PC game, originally, a top-down vampire hack and slash back then, Legacy of Kain was a surprise on the PS1, although a welcome one. We had seen various third-person 3D platformers and action-adventure games, some good, some bad, all often pulling from the classic Metroidvania tropes. Legacy of Kain pretty much does the same thing, just in a really original wrapper. Imagine an apocalyptic vampire setting where the vampires rule the world. Chief vampire, Kain, gets jealous of one of his subordinates, Raziel, who he then kills. However, he isn't really dead and comes back to life as an agent of the Elder God. Given a mission to deal with Kain and his brothers and sister vampires, Raziel fights his way through the game using various powers and weapons. This was the second of a 5-game epic, although I never played Blood Omen, so really this was the first one for me. The theme and style of the game was what really attracted me, and I enjoyed most of the gameplay. It pretty much is hack and slash, then platform puzzle, then back to hacking and slashing in an arena, mixed in with using the various powers you collect. The story is fun, although the ending of this game is a setup for the next part, so don't expect a satisfying conclusion. Going back to it and remembering the other sequels and similar games I played, say like God of War, I can safely point to this game as being one that made me really want to play all the future action-adventure games I came across. Spiderman. If you need a reason to come back to this particular classic, I can give you many. Stan Lee as the narrator, comic book references, the New York skyline, voices from the classic Spider-Man cartoons. For a fan, this game is an absolute godsend and very hard to beat. For a PlayStation game, this is as close to perfection as you can get. From the web swinging to the combat, the game plays as close to being Spider-Man as you could get at the time, and certainly better than the movie tie-in games. Every fight is fun, the levels original, and the story is something right out of the animated series. The final level was one of the most frustrating things I'd encountered, until God of War, but it certainly did not prevent me from finishing the game or even replaying the game. Jumping back into playing the game brought the memories back, finding the collectibles for the costumes, progressing through the skyscraper level puzzles. Every part was as fun and engaging as it was the first time. While it took until the most recent Spider-Man game release for the series to get back to this level of fun, this one helped establish a love of these types of games for me, certainly seeing as not many other Marvel titles of the same genre have ever come close to this. Silent Bomber. One of the founding themes for games that I had a love for with the PS1, and historically PlayStation in general, is crazy concepts for games. And while I am not a bishi-bashi fan, crazy Japanese games, which are mostly anime, are definitely a favoured taste for me. So I bring you a particular piquant item in the form of Silent Bomber. I'll be honest, I picked up the game primarily on the cover and screenshots, because buying games based on reviews back in the PS1 days was a hiding to not buying many games. The plot for this game is very Japanese. Rebels heading to a massive ship to destroy it with bombs in the right places. All the protagonists are pretty, young, and have emotional issues. And the antagonist has the classic ego, chip on his shoulder, pride thing going on, so you can expect to fight him during the game. The game itself? Well, it's not your classic platformer with shooting and or fighting. The gameplay revolves around bombing. Lots of bombing. And running and dashing. And more bombing. The unique game style, along with the anime story, and the surprising difficulty curve, is what dragged me into this game. Coming back to it, I am reminded of the fight I had getting through the levels, and the regret that I didn't really ever complete this one. This is definitely one I would come back to if I have the time. Wu-Tang, Taste the Pain. This game is a very interesting history, especially when you dig into its backstory. The fact the engine it uses got picked up should be no surprise. The engine is very good. But the game it was picked up for, well, that is certainly surprising. Wu-Tang Taste the Pain is a 4-player 3D fighting game which follows the Wu-Tang clan as they fight to reclaim their master. The story is right out of classic Chinese B-movie styles with very 80s villains and a banging soundtrack from the Wu-Tang themselves. It has a surprising number of playable characters, unlockable bosses, and multiplayer mode. The game has a huge amount of depth really for a fighting game, especially back on the PS1 when most cheap fighting games barely had an unlockable boss. The biggest drive for me, and something I would love to see come back in other games, was the 36 chambers you had for each character to help unlock everything. Beating the levels was one thing, having to pull off combo strings and moves to unlock the extras was another, and a hell of a motivator to complete the game. That, and I am a fan of the Wu-Tang in general. Coming back to the game, I'm reminded of the time I spent trying to perfect combos, beat levels, and unlock everything. Sure, there was a cheat code for it, but where's the fun in that? Would I have the patience to do that again? Probably not. But it would be a fun ride with a hell of a banging soundtrack. Although again, YouTube can't play these things. SoulEdge. Transcending history, a tale of a 3D fighter eternally retold. Two players will repeatedly select the same characters and end up with the same outcome, around about 50-50 win rate, except we don't talk about what we played on the 4th version. If you want an in-depth look into all the fighters on the PS1, TK pretty much covers things. For me, I'll stick with a classic that I spent a good amount of time playing and lambasting the so out of field ending fights to get the good and evil endings. SoulEdge is one of the two 3D fighters I spent a significant time with, primarily due to the pirate, but to be fair, most of the characters are just so damn good. Greek goddess, female ninja, honourable samurai, the list goes on. And that's before we even touch on the many characters that then come after them. Also, there's Voldo. The fighting scheme was pretty damn good, weapon fighting not really being explored much in other fighting games. The 3D fighting tactics were very well fleshed out, and you had ring outs, combos, juggles, pacing, blocking, parrying. As you spent time with each character, you could really get a feel for them and their own fighting style. No character is copied, moves are all unique, and each character has their own flow, which was something I really enjoyed as I played the game. The intro music is also some of the best we have ever had, and is iconic as anything from Street Fighter. If you want something to pump you up, I couldn't recommend anything better. Going back to the old PS1 game does highlight how slow things were compared to the pace of the recent variations, but it has a charm that I enjoy and a place that should be in everyone's collection. Jumping Flash. Japanese games are frequently odd and lose something in the translation when they come over to the Western audience, but then you get some games that are so odd that you probably can't translate them. Jumping Flash is one of those games. This is one of the first games that I ever played on the PS1 and very nearly finished, and this was before I even owned the console. Back in the day, you would have the latest console set up in the store, often used to test run games, usually running one specific game for ages until the manager got sick of it. Panzer Dragoon being the other example of a game that I played in this manner. Jumping Flash, though, is crazy. The plot is kind of simple. You play as a robotic rabbit called Robert, who is running around the planet collecting rocket pods, stopping bad guys and saving the planet, although you can't really tell that from the cutscenes. The gameplay centres around a simple arena with lots of places to jump and various enemies you can shoot. No Mario stomping enemies here. The jumping is the biggest thing in this game, with it built in such a way that you look down as you're jumping really high. Bit disorientating when you start, but as you use it you realise how much you need it to nail some of the trickier jumps and to take out some enemies. Levels are timed so you can't coast around, and while some enemies are simplistic, they are enough of a hindrance that you do have to account for them. You can also collect weapons, which are fireworks, and power-ups to make your life a little bit easier. I played this a lot purely because of the crazy aesthetic to start with. The gameplay managed to grip me, however, and I persevered my way, except not to completion. It's not the hardest or longest game, but it is unique and challenging in its own little way. Coming back to the game, I had forgotten the crazy plot that is around this game. The gameplay and the jumping, though, these are things that I solidly remembered. That said, getting back into the play of things kind of shows how rusty I've gotten. For a game I didn't initially own, it made an impression, and to be blunt, I have never really found anything quite like this since. Syphon Filter. When you think of stealth combat games on PS1, or in the early console days, most people would be able to name you one or two titles. One with stompy robots, the other with night vision goggles. Me, I'd be able to give you one with rolling. Lots and lots of rolling. During a time when I was house sitting for some friends, my best friend and I rented the game from Blockbuster to fill the time. It's a third-person shooter filled with lots of silly running, lots of rolling, and a bombastic spy plot, as well as one of the most frustrating levels I'd experienced before one section in God of War. The plot is very classic spy movie style, with agents chasing terrorists around the world, finding plots, secret organisations, double crossings, and many cheesy lines. This is everything that a typical spy movie would have, bar the silly running. Gameplay wise, this was pretty good for a third person game. Getting used to the controls and aiming, and the need for headshots is a bit of a trick, but it is well worth the practice. Enemies are pretty much just bullet sponges if you don't land your shots. Navigation can be a bit of a pain, as this game does not hold your hand or clearly show where you need to go at the best of times. If you miss an objective, which is easy enough, you fail and die. You do have lots of weapons and equipment to play with, which can give you a chunk of variety as you play. That said, you will find some weapons are just a better fit in certain levels, and others that are just flat out workhorses that last for the entire game. The AI is fun to fight against, most of the time, and the levels vary enough that it drags you into the game. Aside from that one level that sees you trying to avoid sniper headshots as you roll around what is basically a football field. If you've played the game, you know the level. Coming back to the game, I had a good chunk of nostalgia. Goofy running aside, the fun of running and gunning, occasionally stealthing, is still as enjoyable as it was then. Sure, there are the frustrating bits where you miss the objectives, or run a bit close to fire so you end up torching yourself, but the fun of the game is still there, and certainly the memories of completing this game, as well as alternating attempts and trying to outdo each other with my best mate, is some of the best memories I've got. Vagrant Story. So, I've mentioned crazy Japanese games and crazy stories. Some of the best that you could find were indeed on the PS1, with one classic leaping to most people's minds when you even mention JRPG. Especially if you mention a Square Enix JRPG. So when it came to celebrating the PS1, you expect the classic JRPG to make an appearance. Or you would if I wasn't currently playing through the remake at the moment and not really wanting to also play the original again. So instead, I'm going to play the lesser known JRPG that Square Enix made, one that is a merging of RPG and action gaming in a sense. Vagrant Story is set in a fantasy industrial world, one where magic and mythical creatures are considered cultish and just merely stories. You play as an elite soldier who is tasked with tracking down and killing this cult leader, who leads you to an abandoned city. And this is where you find out that magic exists, mythical creatures do exist, and what you recall is not what it seems. Although to be fair, the bloody dragon being used as a tutorial at the start really should have tipped you off things were a bit odd. The gameplay is so unique that I've not seen its like since. You play in an isometric third-person action game. You solve puzzles, run over traps, but the combat is more turn-based, active time-based, and is really set around the range of your weapons and if you can run chains and counters. This is a game that I never completed. I think this was due to a bug or something I missed activating later on. In revisiting it, I immediately just wanted to dive straight back in and revel in all the systems it has. While Final Fantasy has some interesting mechanics and builds you can do with the characters, the systems with Vagrant Story really force you to think about what your builds are. What are your preferred weapons? What's the timing of your combos? How you use your magic? All these things push you as a player to play. The enemies you face force you to re-evaluate those tactics on the fly. While looking back, it seems a little bit cheesy and the characters are pretty much cliche at times. This is a game, however, that I am glad to own again. I'm certainly looking forward to delving back into it, although maybe I won't stream it, maybe a complete series. We'll see. My gaming history spans mostly around the PC, from the old Amstrad and ZX Spectrum to clunky 386s and 486s. I never really got in on the console scene, my Sega and Nintendo experience always being secondhand when visiting friends. I never got a PS1 when it was released, and I either rented or played around friends' houses back at launch. Getting my first PlayStation and my first games, making headway through the growing collection that I had. Memories of just filling memory cards and having to make choices over what saves I had to keep. Every single game left their mark one way or the other, and just having to go back over the list of games to pick for this video brought them all flooding back. 25 years ago, this little box released, against the odds, in Europe. I got my own second hand, and every single memory I have, bargain bin diving for anything good, playing the trash, playing the gems, absolutely worth it. I honestly can't remember how many games I ended up with, although I do remember I ended up having to trade them in to upgrade to the PS2 to get Final Fantasy X, although no memory card at the time because they sold out in England, so that was fun. It wasn't a loss at the time, and these days I've been able to play some of the old classics with PS Now on the PS4. But that said, getting some of the old games to play again for this video, going over the lists, this makes me miss my old little grey box. So to wrap up, here is to the grandfather of the PlayStation. Happy 25 years in Europe. Thank you for all the memories.
Thank you for watching. This has been a TigerTails Gaming video celebrating PlayStation Month. If you'd like to keep on top with what we're doing for this month, you can hit one of the videos that are on the screen somewhere, or you can click on the nice subscribe button that we got floating around as well.
Yep. Or you can follow us at TigerTailsGaming.co.uk.
And if you want to help us feed the algorithm, feel free to leave us a like or a comment as well.
Absolutely. But on that note, we need to say goodbye, everybody.
So it's bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.